give this even more context, Greenwald went on to talk about Jude Doyle, about how Jude Doyle was demanding that Substack overhaul its policies so that people like Greenwald, who he called a transphobic bigot, no longer were offered money up front for joining Substack. To be clear, Jude called Glenn a transphobic bigot on the basis of an essay Glenn wrote decrying how a prominent member of the ACLU was pushing the institution away from its core mission to protect civil liberties, including, most prominently, the right to free speech. He was decrying how the ACLU, through one particular member, advocated for the suppression of a book on the subject of detransitioning. Jude didn't say that Greenwald was wrong to be a free speech absolutist, or that Glenn underestimated the psychological and political damage books like the one written by Abigail Shrier did to transgender people and the movement for their rights. But he asserted that Greenwald was irrationally afraid of transgender people and implied that Greenwald was only motivated to stand up for free speech because of his supposed transphobia. If you just spend 5 minutes reading the work of Jude Doyle, pick a blog post at random, you'll find that Greenwald's assertion that within the media sphere, people can gain material benefits from climbing the ladder of oppression will seem sensible, even obvious. But we shouldn't always trust what seems obvious, nor should we let our reactions to one person, or even several people, guide our conclusions. Despite Jude Doyle's clearly opportunistic use of his victim status, transgender people are more likely to be discriminated against, even within media institutions, than to gain material advantages due to their gender identity.
First times that I really, it's funny because despite the recent allegations that I'm like this, anti-trans warrior or whatever, the reality is I barely have ever spoken about the trans debate. Like literally almost never, in part because it was just something that I just instinctively supported for the reason that I said earlier, which is that it's just okay. My philosophy is if the person who's born a biological male identifies as a female, they ought to be able to live their lives as a female and have society respect that, have the law respect that. Like it didn't seem that complicated to me. And the only times even up until now that I've ever written about it were in the context of just free speech issues, when like a book about trans issues gets banned from Amazon, and I write about it from the perspective of free discourse and free speech rather than the trans issue itself.
Even so, it wouldn't undermine Greenwald's primary point. Lying about, smearing, and censoring people you disagree with, trying to drive them out of the media industry, might serve individuals seeking to win a zero-sum game. It might further their own careers. But these tactics undermine the struggle for social justice and for transgender rights. These tactics make the people who use them look terrible, even when they win. These tactics are off-putting to everyone when they're on the receiving end of them, and even to many who might otherwise agree with Jude Doyle or Sam Seder politically.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you guys for coming. Sorry you didn't see us on Saturday. We did not have a show Saturday, but we're back. I promise we'll be back. And let me first introduce my co-host, my homie, my dog, Mr. Pascal Robert.
What is good, Jason Miles and the This Is Revolution audience? How is everyone doing?
First of all, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
And shout out, our moderator is probably going to be pretty busy tonight. John Ross is the moderator of the show. I expect him to be in the chat doing his thing tonight. We are bringing on a friend of ours, friend of show. He's actually one of the reasons why this show has grown. He took a chance on this little show and put it on his channel. And now he has taken a match and lit his career totally on fire. His name is Douglas Lain.
Hey, not just my career, but when that channel goes, so does your support over there. So you better fight for me here.
Well, I'm here today to say that white supremacy and not my problem.
Okay. Well, I don't know what that means in context, but Glenn Greenwald is not supposed to be. No one's calling him a white supremacist, as far as I know. Yeah, I don't really think I did take a match to my career. I just got some bad, some people not very happy with me on YouTube, but I figure that's par for the course.
So I saw that. I want to say I saw when you posted the video. I was sitting at home and I could watch YouTube through our very large television that the wonderful woman that I live with wanted to buy, and I get to see, in H fucking D. I was like, Doug's really going for it with this Glenn Greenwald thing because everybody hates Glenn, and
it's not.
I thought it was a great video. I hit up Pascal right away. I hit up Jean Bajlan right away. And before I go even further, I want to bring on another guest we're having.
Oh, okay.
Someone said in the chat, you have Doug Lain and Shahid Buttar. There's two kings.
Oh wow.
Two guys that have seen the circular firing squad of the left. When I saw your video, I thought of Shahid. When Shahid finally confirmed, I was like, we could make this segments, but why do that? I don't think Doug's ever actually met Shahid. And actually, when Doug was on my show originally early last year, he actually had some good things to say about Shahid while he was going through his bullshit. Now I can't remember if that was off air or not.
Probably was on there. Hey.
Shahid Buttar.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Good to be back with you, Jason. Good to see you all.
Brother comrade Shahid Buttar, how are you, brother?
I'm all right. I can't complain. I mean, I could, but a lot of people have it much worse than any of us do. So I'm lucky for that.
Someone says that you lived through Angela Nagel, Doug, so you'll be fine with your Glenn Greenwald video.
Yeah. Well, I learned lessons from that. We could talk about that in a bit.
Glenn Greenwald actually had good things to say about Shahid Buttar when he was going through his stuff. I think Glenn was still at the Intercept while that was going on.
I think he was still at the Intercept at the time. Yeah, I think he regarded, and he regards in a lot of cases, these identity-based smears as a distraction from the underlying issues. And in San Francisco, we've become no stranger to it. I was the first of 3 different public figures of color in the last 9 months who've been smeared. Gloria Berry after me, and then most recently Allison Collins. This pattern of racial divide and conquer that is spreading across the left is racial and gender, but identity-based, dividing and conquering. And it is both unfortunate and entirely intentional. It is pushed and weaponized by a political establishment that recognizes the opportunity to defang the left by pitting it against itself. So I'm hopeful, at least, that people come to recognize the pattern enough to be somewhat inoculated against it going forward.
It's an old COINTELPRO tactic, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. It is absolutely a COINTELPRO tactic. And if the left had any memory, one of my concerns precisely with the new left is that it is not entirely anti-imperial. It's more concerned with housing than it is with the CIA. And I get it, that makes sense. One is very near to home and one is very remote and one is very ever present. And the other one, you kind of have to sit with to even recognize. But just think about the role of the CIA running crack cocaine into the United States and how that impacted policing. We cannot escape the predictable results of our litany of, in many cases, ongoing human rights abuses. And it's a perfect example of how, the issues that seem out of sight and end up out of mind end up having a very real impact on very daily lives of people just trying to survive. And it doesn't surprise me for a minute to see the replication of tactics from that era. There are stories in development that I can't quite allude to because there are investigative journalists exploring, and I'm not one of them. So I've heard about stories that people are investigating. That would suggest any number of things. But yeah, to your point, it is absolutely a tried and true tactic of intelligence agencies to sow mistrust within movements through false accusation. And, I can't say anything more specifically than that, but
gotcha.
It is a pattern.
Well, my wonderful co-host actually came up with some great questions. Pascal Robert, are you ready to fire off the first question?
I very much am. Shahid, once again, thank you for coming on our show. And I'd like to ask you, you experienced a pretty nasty example of the left cannibalizing one of its own. Do you think the constant internal bickering amongst today's left is a consequence of the class makeup of this left and, frankly, their lack of skin in the game? Meaning that for many of the left, this is a cerebral exercise as opposed to life and death politics, as it was with the working class left we had in the early 20th century.
It's a thoughtful question. I think it's a piece of it, to the extent there is a segment of the left that we would perhaps describe as privileged. Now, that's a word that's been used in the recent context and lent itself to any number of debates, right? And I don't think that does describe the left. In my mind, the left are the workers at Amazon who were struggling to form a union. You know, the left is the people in the street responding to the murders of our neighbors. You know, the left are undocumented dreamers, classmates and friends and students who are trying to maintain a foothold in the country and gain access to a pathway to citizenship. I don't think the left are the hyper-resourced or privileged or loud voices. You know, I don't think Brooklyn Dad is the left, for instance, you know.
Well, I mean, Brooklyn Dad would be a liberal, but the thing is, though, we do have an echo chamber of a chattering class of quote-unquote people who consider themselves leftist, socialist, DSA, imperialist, or progressive, whatever the your term of what you want to choose, so be it, is, who consider themselves left of the traditional Democratic Party. And that constellation is fairly well occupied by highly educationally pedigreed, professional adjacent type individuals. And
Sure.
they tend to congregate around a certain kind of discourse in certain spaces. And my question to you is that reality in and of itself to a more practical politics that doesn't get sucked into internet bullshit, if you to use a direct phrase?
Absolutely, no question there. And it's the difference between a politics that is focused on critique and a politics that is focused on building. And it's easy to critique, right? I mean, you can critique all day, but the critique doesn't frankly move us anymore.
Damn.
And a politics that is focused on building bridges, making connections, organizing. I mean, I've been organizing for 20 years, and the smears that targeted me knocked me back 2 years at the end of the day, but they didn't knock me out. And that's because the left, actually, like the real left, the grassroots left, stuck by me, right? The privileged left, the chattering class, as you described it, they promote virtue signaling as a more beguiling, easier, more visible, and ultimately completely meaningless, ephemeral alternative to movement building. And I'm not a virtue signaler, I am a movement builder. And I do think that what you're describing is a fetish for policing a movement as distinct from expanding it. And part of this we have to root in neoliberalism, because the very the idea of identity politics as a locus around which to build coalitions is a neoliberal contrivance invented effectively to destroy the left. And because there were points when, Fred Hampton was killed for this, when people organized across communities. I, as an organizer, have organized across communities for 20 years. That's what makes me dangerous, and they only smear you if they fear you. And frankly, the establishment has lots of reasons to fear me and the people who support us all here. We have the wind at our backs in the context of a generation that's been radicalized. And this is maybe the last point I make here in terms of who is the left. I don't think of the left as the Vanguard. I think of the left as the people under the boot. And generationally, that's increasingly everyone. And that, in my mind, makes the transition, the paradigm shift, inexorable, inevitable. It's precisely also what incentivizes these kinds of attacks, because the inclination to police a movement only emerges when there's a perception of something there to fight over, when there's turf to be fought over. And when you're building turf, you're not as inclined to fight over it, right? Like I'm not trying to slice up a pie, I'm trying to build it. And people who are maybe who have different intentions, let's just put it that way, to be charitable, might approach the game very differently. And I absolutely agree with you that it's an obstacle. And at the end of the day, all we can do is continue to build bridges, ideally anticipate these kinds of identity-based attacks. And the key I would want to offer here is insist upon time, patience, investigation, and due process before leaping to conclusions when activists and candidates of color are accused of predictable offenses.
Doug,
Yeah.
I think it was you. I don't want to say you said this, and I don't want to put this on you, but Doug Lain, Shahid, I don't know if you know Doug's work. I don't want to. I'm just putting the words in Doug's mouth, and that'll be the quote. Well, Doug said all black people. So Doug responds to people's comments, not all the time, but if it really gets to him, he'll respond, which is interesting to me.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was Doug that said this, or maybe it was Varn that said it, but it was somebody, I want to say in the Zero Books family, that said it's a lot. The online left is a lot of liberals cosplaying as communists. Was that you, D, or was that somebody else?
I said something kind of like that, I think, on Facebook.
Yeah, it was Facebook.
Yeah. No. So I think I actually want to question this idea that the left isn't a vanguard, because on the one hand, I can see why you would want to distance yourself from that kind of language. But as someone who's trying to figure out how to be a Marxist, I wonder if we need something like a left vanguard that can think past the impasse we're in. Because my concern about focusing only on organizing is that you end up organizing for the center of the Democratic Party, even when you're successful. And that what might be needed right now is another kind of party, a socialist party, which would have to have not only a base of mass support in the working class, but also have a different group of people who are leading it. It's hopefully not me, but someone who has developed a thorough and deep critique, not only of capitalism, but also of the last 100 years of socialism or so, that we rethink how we've been handling the perpetual crisis that is the capitalist system, and try to create a new movement and party for radical revolutionary change. And I just think that's such a big task, and we can't just valorize the idea of everyday people who, after all, are by defining them as everyday, you limit them to working within the system as it is. Who knows where the vanguard will come from, but the point is that we do need a different kind of thinking.
I was with you right up until the end when you were talking about the idea of everyday people being inherently sort of limited in how they engage. Because in my mind, when I think of everyday people engaging, I go to Occupy, and we didn't have a leader. It was a leader full movement. And we certainly weren't organizing within the center of the Democratic Party. We were organizing around visionary demands that, with all due respect to contemporary politics, we were on the right train a decade ago. Like, if anybody listened to us in the institutional establishment 10 years ago, we could have averted Trump and preempted that whole ball of wax. With the financial sagas of the more recent years could have been avoided. Like, the political culture has come around finally to recognize what we were saying 10 years ago. And in the context of War and Peace in our international empire 20 years ago. And, there's not a lot of solace in being right when your civilization continues to step off cliffs. And so when I think of the leaderful movement led by everyday people, I think of the students, I think of the carpenters, I think of the beauticians, I think of the people, the Air Force colonel who I met at Occupy St. Louis the first day that we launched there. I think of literally everyday people, and the reason why their participation, frankly, is the only kind that matters. And a vanguard, I don't want to say a vanguard is irrelevant. A vanguard matters. I construe myself as having been part of it. But the force that turns the ship of our body politic has to be more than just the people leaning on the rudder. And that's why the participation of everyday people matters. The point here I'd want to make is that building on-ramps to easy participation is critical. That's one of the things that make online activism beguiling. And as more people engage in those easy steps, ultimately at the margins, increasingly meaningless. But I'm a big fan of offline, and the pandemic makes this hard. Hopefully this will get easier soon. Offline, face-to-face, in-person organizing connections and actions. Because in those face-to-face interactions, in between the flashpoints, are moments of interaction, connection, and community building. And when our community builds in the context of our expressive participation, that's a regenerative exercise. It builds on itself, it feeds on itself. When we formed the artist collectives in Palo Alto and San Francisco and Washington, D.C., that have been speaking truth to power for 20 years, that's how we did it. And that's a micro version of what I hope to happen at a more macro scale. But one place where I really want to come back to what Doug was saying and draw a circle around it and agree wholeheartedly is the need for challenges to the center outside the establishment. Now, you were talking about a socialist party. I don't even know if it has to be partisan. I frankly think an assertive labor movement that was willing to challenge the Democratic Party and support challengers to it on behalf of its rank and file might be enough. Whether a renewed labor movement or a socialist party or a widespread revival of the Occupy movement, there are a lot of different tactics and strategies in the toolbox, and I'm not in a position to try to deny any of them the opportunity to express themselves. And frankly, I'd like to see them all happen. But I do think especially the assertive consciousness of whether it's the working class, low-income communities of color, undocumented folks, marginalized people speaking up, as we have been doing increasingly in all kinds of different fora, that forces the system to heal. And I see it at the moment reflected symbolically in rhetoric. I could go on, but I'm just yapping. I think we have to real. And I think we
Pascal?
Yeah, I had a question. I said, how can we even consider today's left an oppositional political force when so much of it is funded by capitalist philanthropy and so much of it is contingent on academics who also depend on those foundations to fund their research?
Do people remember Ward Churchill? It's a name I like to bring up at every opportunity. So Ward Churchill was a historian, indigenous, Native American, professor at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And he was fired despite having tenure for something he said in his analysis of the 9/11 attacks. Now, what he said was pretty provocative. He described the people who died in the 9/11 attacks as little Eichmanns. And, that's a hard thing for a lot of people to hear. And I'm not going to defend the statement, but I will say from the standpoint of an indigenous historian, it's a fair observation. And, that's an example of how the discursive limits are placed even within spaces that are supposed to have, for instance, academic freedom. I'd again sort of strike at the same premise I did before when you were describing the left as like the nonprofit industrial complex. And I come from it. I've worked for different nonprofits. I've led a nonprofit, and shout out to a couple of those groups. Muslim Advocates is one I helped start a program at. I led the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, which is now Defending Rights and Dissent. I worked most recently in the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And one I started my career at was the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy, now led by Russ Feingold, former U.S. Senator. I'm very, very excited about that. But so to describe those groups, or the ACLU, or the Earth Justice Legal Defense Fund, or the Sierra Club as the left, I think does a disservice to the left, because the left has never been about institutionalized groups. And the nonprofit industrial complex is the sort of like edge of what I describe ultimately as a neoliberal center. And I think in your characterization of them, Pascal, you're totally accurate to describe them as limited by the appetites of philanthropic funders. But that's precisely why I wouldn't accept them as legitimate representatives of the left, because as long as you're reliant on an ultimately corporate derived paycheck, there is a limitation in expressive freedom. Frankly, it's one reason why I ran for office, because as a nonprofit advocate, you have a great deal of focus, you have a great deal of support, and you have a great deal of restraint and restriction, because you're limited to what the consensus is among the governing body. And every institution has its mission, and yet all of the different missions and issues intersect. which is to say any component of the nonprofit industrial complex is going to be inadequate to the task because the mechanism of oppression is intersectional, just like the exercise of liberation has to be intersectional. And nonprofits are built inherently to be siloed. And so I think that's an inherent limitation. But again, these are all the more reasons why I would describe these as not being legitimate representatives of the left. Now, I want to give a counterpoint to that. There are some voices within that milieu that do particularly aim to support the margins. Now, here I'm thinking of like the Ruckus Society or Media Justice, groups that are as close to the front line as institutional groups can be. And the reason why I separate them is that they play an infrastructural role that the left can frankly leverage. I've been to any number of direct action trainings sponsored by and executed and hosted by the Ruckus Society, and I've seen all kinds of people become activated and empowered through that process. And they're not answerable to any philanthropic foundation. They're just free agents, people in the body politic who have skills. Similarly with Media Justice, as they empower communities and people to take action online and offline to change the narrative, they are not beholden to their trainers in how they execute and use those skills. And so those kinds of base building, empowering strategies, I think, can help liberate us from those constraints by philanthropic funders. Again, I think you're totally right to observe the dynamic. I just wouldn't accept them as the left.
I mean, my larger critique, right, and this is part of something that Jason, I think even Doug has heard me say before, is that I question whether or not there is such a thing as a left or whether we just have a bunch of leftists. Because my position is that, is there something called the left in America that has the same influence in policy and realpolitik that goes on in this country in the way that we have on the right? And I would argue that we don't have that, and we haven't had that in 50 years as part of my theme, the 50-year counter-revolution. Now, I will agree that is debatable, and I have no problem with that. But the constellation of what we call the left today, we're basically dealing with a phenomenon that comes about after the 2008 crash, starting with Occupy and so on and so forth. And I think your response to my question is fair and correct. But I don't think that diminishes the reality that much of that quote-unquote constellation of the left is thoroughly entrenched in the nonprofit industrial complex.
Absolutely.
Or the online discourse.
And you're talking about, and somebody asked a question about, thank you for the super chat, Anji. How do you feel about mutual aid? Do you believe it builds solidarity based on material conditions or enables the system? Doug, how do you feel about that?
I feel like that it does both, but then so does going to work every day. I mean, you're so I feel like no one tactic is going to be the solution for how to get out from under the capitalist system. And I think people like to throw around buzzwords like mutual aid or dual power as if, they've got the, password that gets you in to the speakeasy or something, you just,
that's the password to your speakeasy.
Yeah. If you say it's not swordfish anymore, it's,
Lenin's.
It's Lain and Lenin.
Going to Lenin's over on O'Farrell.
Yeah, that's right. So, anyway, no, but I'm not against. I mean, like, who is against mutual aid? But I would say, to kind of go back to the question of Occupy Wall Street, I look at that moment as one where there was a lot of energy and excitement, and I thought we were really on the cusp of a major change in not just American but global politics. Especially after the Arab Spring was followed by Occupy Wall Street.
Yep.
But I also witnessed how it operated, at least here in Portland, on the ground. And what happened was that there was a leadership of Occupy, but they weren't accountable because it was supposed to be a leaderless movement. And a lot of people were using the movement as a way to train up to become a part of the Democratic Party. The people who were the leaderless leaders of Occupy Portland were, getting trained on how to do media events and how to organize. And And a lot of those people did end up going on to not the nonprofit sector or the NGOs, not just in Portland, but throughout Occupy. Or another thing that happened was a lot of people ended up moving to the right after Occupy and sort of getting obsessed with Bitcoin and libertarian kind of projects, and so all sorts of weird crank material came out of Occupy. But the truth was, at the time, the tactic was more important than the plan. And in Portland, Occupy was overrun by marginalized people who really had severe problems that the organizers weren't able to deal with very well.
That was a pattern across the sites, that last piece, for sure.
And there was no plan really to get through the winter either. So I got the sense amongst a lot of people who were like in charge of the tents and making sure food was made and things like that, the people who were really running the show, that there was a sense of relief when the mayor finally said, we will have no more of this. We're going to send in the cops. Because I watched as people were taking Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Portland down like 2 days before the cops actually came in. And so there was no will to stay. And it was not because of the cops per se or Obama orchestrating the cops to turn people out, which happened. It was also because the internal operation wasn't functioning.
Right. You nailed it right there. The internal operation wasn't functioning. And part of that was just because it was so ambitious. I mean, Occupy was not just an occupation of public space for the expressive purposes. Because it was an occupation of public space, it became a service delivery point for every person in crisis in every city where we were holding public space, because our public institutions are absent or dismantled entirely, right? And so, yeah, that was exactly what made the tactic untenable, was the need to provide services and hold space for and support people in crisis, and the movement, frankly, doesn't have capacity for that. This is one reason why we now contemporarily have recognized the need, as we frankly said 10 years ago, to defund the police, because we need social workers in our communities. We saw that firsthand because we were on the streets 24/7. We saw it. What you're observing was the need for social workers. And it's not as if, that need went away just because the occupations went away. The people just became invisible because there wasn't a community then to be a part of.
Were people choosing to go to Occupy rather than homeless shelters and other institutions which would have been supporting them before, because Occupy was more of a party kind of like atmosphere? Because that was something I heard around Occupy. It's like, oh, I love it here. We get drunk every night. You can get drugs here. There's no minders. Everyone's equal.
I mean, if that's the case, why wouldn't you want to go there opposed to a shelter, which not just is going to have rules depending on what kind of shelter it is. It's just going to be problematic and sometimes violent and just not a good place to be. So I sure, that sounds like what people would do. I mean, we had at the hotels, there were people that refused to go to the hotel. There were people that actually would like walk out and leave. There were people that refused permanent housing. Like, I've seen people refuse shit to the point where you're like, why are they refusing shit? And people in the life would be like, you can't argue with some certain people that have drug and alcohol problems, that have had it chronically for years. And if you're going to give them a spot where they can get fucked up, people are going to get fucked up. That's somewhat safe.
Right. I mean, the problem was that the Occupy was trying to handle, and I think we agree, were really deep and the combination of trying to, as you said, provide services for people who are in crisis as well as create a political movement. It was too much for that group. It was too much for those people at that time to handle. And I'm not sure if defunding the cops and investing more in social workers would have solved the problem or not. But I think that, I'm not sure. I mean, frankly, I don't know what would have made Occupy more successful than it was.
I think that's taking on. I'll say this. I wasn't there for Occupy. The closest I got to Occupy was I came back from tour. I forget where I was in the country, and we came to San Francisco just to see different people because we were in the middle of the country for hella long. I remember that. And you get tired of looking at white people. And so we just fucking took the train to San Francisco. And I just remember we saw them shut down the Wells Fargo. I think it was, they had shut down the Wells Fargo, and I was kind of blown away by that. I was like, oh wow, this is pretty neat. There's a good vibe in the air. And I feel like the next day the narrative changed from we are the 99% to there's a bunch of vagrants and homeless people shooting dope everywhere, and it's going to cost you money because the city's going to have to clean this mess up.
Can I tell you a moment that happened almost exactly, I was going to say 10, but I guess it was 9 years later, last year, not long after the murder of George Floyd. I saw a bank in Oakland, and it was not long after that the rhetoric started emerging about the violent Antifa movement and all this, you know, the concern around the protests being too loud and assertive. And it's interesting why, how, the establishment has such invisible concerns when it's bodies of particularly Black and brown people that are piling up. And, the minute a bank is shut down, it's a whole different story in terms of the institution's response. I want to go back maybe 10 minutes ago. There was this question about mutual aid. And I know that we sort of, focus on Occupy, but I want to address that really squarely. I can't speak more highly of a strategy than mutual aid. And I always link it back to the Montgomery bus boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott wasn't just a boycott in the sense that people withheld their purchasing power. They organized alternatives. They had a rideshare network. This is how people got around. It's how people worked around the boycott. Mutual aid is the capacity. It's not just the delivery of services and goods and support to your neighbors. It's the capacity of a community to meaningfully resist, even when the establishment doesn't have, for instance, support. Like, for instance, if you rely on the market to eat or feed your kids, which most of us do, we live in this civilization, there is a limit to how you might participate. A general strike, for instance, at the moment would likely fall on the shoulders of too many people needing too many market-based services to survive. Mutual aid is helping people, through the moment and building the long-term capacity to defect from the market. That is huge, indescribably influential, because when we can defect from the market en masse, we can dictate the terms in a different way than we are when we are effectively supplicants to it, as we are today. And so mutual aid, and the other thing I'd say about mutual aid that's so important is it's possible to engage at a micro scale. A lot of times in this day and age, as part of our technologically influenced culture, people are always insistent upon thinking at scale. Mutual aid is best when it is not at scale, when it is small, neighborly, when it is face to face. That's when it's actually its most resilient. And it's the thing that anybody can do. Anybody can cook a pot of chili and take it to your neighbors. It is literally that simple. And I hope to see more and more of it. I think the pandemic, one silver lining in the cloud of it is it's been this flowering of mutual aid efforts across the country. And at the very least, it's brought a lot of people together. And I hope to see us together take the next step into using the power that community can enable.
I want to start a debate here. Damn
it, Doug! I was trying to put out the fire you started earlier this week.
Sorry, but I started podcasting in 2009 after the economic crisis. So I was starting like a socialist leaning podcast around that time, and I started interviewing economists and ecological warriors and primitivists and all sorts of different people. And I actually wrote a book called Pick Your Battle, which was about foraging. In Portland, there's lots of fruit trees around. You can go out and pick fruit. And I was thinking about, the need at that time, especially for a more resilient economy. And I was an advocate for kitchen gardens, or, basically backyard gardens. And as I got deeper and deeper into it, I realized that the kind of economy I was imagining, where people would be able to sustain themselves through their own backyard or through foraging through their neighbors' fruit trees, was one that was also being built on the back of a massive, productive commodity-based economy. and that the vast majority of people weren't going to be able to grow enough on their land to support themselves, let alone their own community, and that we had a massive agricultural business led infrastructure, and that the problem was not just that we weren't self-reliant enough, but that it was really that we didn't have control over the way we went about producing the things we needed in the world. And I was an anarchist when I started, and I was a Marxist when I finished. And I thought to myself that at first, oh yeah, what I want to do to protect my family is get those backyard gardens going, get some chickens for eggs, and and maybe reach out to my neighbors to share fruit. And by the end of it, I was thinking, what I want to do is organize with other workers to overthrow the commodity form and start a socialist party to change the foundation of society. And ended up making a YouTube instead, but in any case, I'll stop there.
What did you say, Shahid? Your thing broke.
I was just thinking that those don't have to be exclusive endeavors. I mean, I was going to ask to Doug, to what extent did you find those projects mutually conducive?
Well, I found that there was a lot of anti-working class kind of sentiment that was weaved into the localism, self-reliant kind of hippie culture in Portland. That a lot of it was about, I want to eat real food and not this mass-produced junk that people who have to go to work for a regular wage eat. So there was definitely a middle-class component to the aesthetic of it as it exists now. But and I also found that it was shot through with NGOs and nonprofit groups that were, you could get locally foraged fruit from a nonprofit group of young white kids who were helping, going to people's homes and picking the apples that people weren't actually picking and making them available to people in need, but not on any kind of scale that actually mattered. It was more like a resume building exercise. And the primitivists I ran into were backwards and reactionary eventually. The people who wanted to get back to our roots, meaning like live off the land without technology at all, and who hated farming and that kind of thing, were politically utopian in some good ways, but in an awful lot of bad ways as well. So I just have been through, I feel like that's that moment where everyone wanted to go local and try to be self-reliant, and to the extent that we turned inward, we didn't build a political movement to actually change the foundation of society.
And it takes both pieces of that. I think of it almost as survival and resistance. And for many of us, if you're part of a marginalized community, existence is resistance, right? But I also see, part of what you're saying there, Doug, is the sort of like capacity of communities to survive, and then the capacity of communities to advocate. And I do think one can conduce the other if there's that program. I do want to shout out the comment by Joshua that just displayed on the screen about mutual aid giving him the vibes of GoFundMe's as an alternative to healthcare. And that's real. I mean, just to be clear here, the reason we're talking about mutual aid is because the market-based capitalist economy is a demonstrable failure. It does not meet the needs of our civilization or our communities, or particularly young people today. And that's been made all too clear. And so now, in the wake of that failure, we're sort of assessing different, I think, ultimately complementary ways to engage that failure. I think of mutual aid like a GoFundMe as sort of like doing what we can to create a net at the bottom to catch each other. And part of what I'm suggesting is that in the creation of that net, we not only catch each other, but we bring us together, and we enable the resilience to defect from the market and actually build the new in the shell of the old, while we ideally pull all the levers, organize the marches, the rallies, the occupations, the advocacy campaigns, the electoral campaigns to force change through the system. I don't think we have the luxury of being exclusive in our approach.
Let me ask you a question. Are we the type of leftists who are saying that we don't believe that the state has a role in providing the services that we're saying the private sector is not willing to do anymore? I mean, one of the things that I often think of when I think about mutual aid is that it becomes a replacement for state functionality. It has a very libertarian appeal to it, or anarchist appeal, or depending on which side of the coin you're on. So again, I'm not laying down the market here, but have we given up on the notion of the state fulfilling the needs of society in this way?
Not at all. I think of mutual aid both as a short-term stopgap as well as a shaming of the state, ideally a lever to organize people to bring together to then push the state. And I think it's all of those things at once. I think part of what Doug was describing before was the seeming tension behind what could be competing objectives. But I think, again, they are complementary if they're approached in a holistic way. Because if we, just to take an example here, the brake light clinics that I've seen any number of socialist organizations start around the country. Those are mutual aid efforts to help neighbors avoid the criminal justice system. And it's an outreach lever to do some public education and expand the network. When we've seen Food Not Bombs is a great example of mutual aid that also has been so effective in supporting movement building that the FBI for the last 20 years has classified Food Not Bombs as a precursor of intelligence problems. I mean, they track Food Not Bombs as if it was a terror organization because so many rights activists and Earth liberation activists have come through that network. Mutual aid radicalized them. Mutual aid.
Wasn't it the Clinton administration that made it possible to track domestic organizations like Food Not Bombs as a terrorist organization?
You're thinking particularly of the AETA, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. This is so important. I'm so glad that you raised this. The conventional wisdom is that a constitutional crisis started on September 12th, 2001. And people completely forget that we had been jailing environmentalists as terrorists for almost a decade by that point. About a third of the people detained in U.S. prisons today as convicted terrorists are white men, now middle-aged, mostly from Oregon and Washington.
Yeah, people in my cohort, people I knew.
Well, why do you think Law and Order did a whole season arc where pregnant Mariska Hargitay becomes an undercover FBI agent that is stopping domestic terrorism, and domestic terrorism is just animal rights activists. She basically went undercover for these violent PETA meets the Weather Underground cells.
They got a whole season of that?
They had a whole season of that.
Oh, wait, I'm right.
It's the season where Lars from Metallica's ex-wife was Elliot's partner. What? I know way too much about that show.
Crazy. I had no idea.
But that whole, I always feel like pop culture softens reality for people, so it's easier for them to deal with.
Yeah.
Pascal definitely talks about it in his writing for Black Agenda Report. But that's one of those things when you bring that up, that was an actual, like, we're going to go attack the domestic terrorists. And it wasn't the white supremacists that are shooting up schools and people.
Yeah.
It was people letting animals out of cages, and, these priests that are putting their blood all over testing facilities and even nuclear plants, arms manufacturers. Like, these are the domestic terrorists that your tax dollars are stopping.
And in Oregon, it was the people blowing up bulldozers to stop the logging and things like that.
Yeah.
People doing the treats. Now, fast forward to the January 6th insurrection, and now the awareness of domestic terrorists. And just to be clear, there was an FBI whistleblower in 2004. Mike German is his name, who said that the white nationalist community is organizing major terror plots. They wanted to bomb energy facilities, to poison major cities' water resources. I mean, the January 6th insurrection, to anybody who was paying even the slightest bit of attention, was entirely not just predictable, it was predicted. For 16 years, it took whistleblowers to get anybody to pay attention to that. I was a Muslim civil rights organizer watching all the mosques get infiltrated, listen to whistleblowers saying there are real domestic terror problems and they ain't it. And, it's interesting to see this discourse around.
Well, at the same time, there was a lot of expansion of power to survey the domestic population because of militia groups. It wasn't like Bill Clinton didn't also target these right-wing militia groups. And I which I'm, of course, totally opposed to these people. But I worry that in the rush to do something about white supremacy, we're going to empower a lot of legislators to pass laws that will end up tamping down everyone's civil rights and civil liberties. And, if it's possible, make us even more surveilled and cowed and afraid and unable to organize.
Doubly so, because not only is there now this awareness of this, I dare say, legitimate security threat, but to add to it, and this is very pernicious in the way that you're describing, Doug, legislators are scared. And when legislators are scared, they do stupid, stupid things that place everyone at risk. And that's a pattern we've seen over and over and over again. And I could not agree with you more. Ultimately, the point I'd want to make there, just responding to the lurking danger of that security apparatus seeking more resources and power, we know for a fact that the security apparatus failed to use its powers to defend Congress on that day and well before. And what we don't need more powers for these agencies. What we need are investigations in the agencies to root out the white supremacists within them. That's what this January 6th insurrection seemed to me to be, a clarion call for investigations of intelligence and military and police departments across the United States. There are tens of thousands of them. And we have no idea as a body politic how deeply rooted that infection has become. And is it metastatic? I don't know. Can we comfort ourselves and pretend that it's not without checking? No, we absolutely cannot. So before Congress considers new powers for these agencies or more budgets for police, and forgive me, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is an interesting thing to reflect upon this week as George Floyd's murderer is on trial. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, while it would do a great many good things, it would also increase police budgets and surveillance. That's not what our movements are asking for.
I didn't like that bill. I really didn't like the bill. I didn't really care to outlaw the chokehold because the chokehold got outlawed in LA 10 years before Rodney King caught that ass whooping. And a lot of other people got put to death by the police after the chokehold. So to act like the chokehold is the end all be all, and let's keep in mind he was killed with a knee, not a standard police chokehold that they're taught to use. The George Floyd Act felt like I'm putting his name on some bullshit, and the people that got behind it kind of hurt my feelings. But that kind of goes into another question we had kind of for the both of you guys about electoral politics. But I have to ask this question as we get closer to the hour being over. Shahid, do you have any time? I know you're a very busy man.
I can kick it. Yeah, it's good.
Doug, do you have a little more time?
Yeah, I can give you a little more time.
We kill it at the hour, and then we go to our patron only section.
There are people on Twitter who I could be arguing with, but
I'm trying to save you a Twitter waste of your time on Twitter. Someone basically left a comment to Doug Lain that was the equivalent of "Good day, sir."
There were a bunch of those, actually. Yeah,
they read the title of his piece, and it said, "Well, now I know for sure I am unsubscribing." And all I could see when I see that, because our videos get played there, was that's one less viewer.
Yeah, we gained in subscribers and Patreon support by a lot, actually, since that video has gone.
It's all alt-right.
I don't know who's watching or who's giving us money, but I do know that that my sin, I should point out, the sin here was I said I love Glenn Greenwald. That was my sin. That was what made everyone so angry.
Yeah. It didn't matter what you said after that.
He's an international hero.
Right.
Anybody who deigns to critique Glenn Greenwald without understanding the magnitude of his contribution, there's just the fact that we could document the intelligence services, what we had known in the advocacy community was happening for a decade, but we couldn't document until Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras and Edward Snowden connected. That is a service to humanity, like the likes of which few people make over the course of a lifetime, let alone, over the course of a few evenings. I mean, can nobody mess with Glenn Greenwald or Bernie Sanders in my mind? I mean, each of them.
Right. And my opinion is, of course, you can critique Glenn Greenwald all you want. I even critique people as saintly as Noam Chomsky from time to time. But to try to cancel him or to try to say that he's some sort of right wing enemy of the working class, or enemy of trans people, or enemy of just regular people, is crazy. I actually think that Glenn's politics are to the right of my own, in terms of like, he's more of a libertarian and less of a socialist. He's more legalistic in his thinking, and less of an expansive utopian kind of socialist visionary like me. But he's very, very useful, obviously, in the struggle. And just, if you're trying to find out what's going on in the world, reading Glenn Greenwald's work will help you figure that out. And I just feel like people should admire that and appreciate that about him, without trying to cancel him on Twitter every day and waste their life trying to get rid of a guy who's not going anywhere.
Well, enough about Glenn Greenwald.
No, we can never say enough about Glenn Greenwald.
No, we can right now. Enough. I did want to ask Shahid, 2020 is around the corner, and you actually, I was a campaign donor. I was a volunteer on the campaign. I knocked on too many doors, went to neighborhoods I didn't know existed in San Francisco, and I'm from here.
As much as I saw anyone last year. So no, it's for real. You were stalwart.
I was there. So you wrote something today about almost like the royal family of Pelosi, and there is talk of Nancy Pelosi handing down, I just said her throne, but her daughter taking up her congressional seat.
Yeah.
And are you thinking about running again for 2022, or is that too much of a long answer? Do you have like the short?
No, that's a fair question to raise. The LA Times, a month ago, not quite a month ago, almost that long ago, ran a story about the Pelosi's open aspiration for decades to put Christine Pelosi in her mother's seat whenever she does eventually retire. It also noted how there are any number of established center-left career progressives in San Francisco who might want the seat and to follow Pelosi, but none of them wanted bad enough to challenge her, which is an interesting indication about the depth of their convictions. And having just won 80,000 votes against Nancy and having compelled her into half a dozen policy concessions, two things which no one's ever done before, I frankly feel obligated to hold her accountable. So I haven't announced yet. I am actively recruiting support in order to relaunch, and anybody who's interested in adding a voice to Congress that will fight for the future, and one that is not beholden to the party establishment, but will rather remove the leader and hopefully liberate our allies in Congress to be bolder, can visit our site, shahidforchange.us, or find us on any of the social platforms at Shahid for Change.
All right. Pascal, you still have some more questions for these two gentlemen, right?
I do have a couple left.
And Ford, right?
What'd you say?
I was just wanted to shout out to Pascal if he worked with Glenn Ford, because I love me some Glenn Ford.
Glenn Ford was my editor at Black Agenda Report. I used to talk to Glenn all the time. I worked with Glenn and Bruce Dixon and Margaret, all of them. Yeah, you know Glenn. You've worked with. We talked to Glenn personally.
Glenn has interviewed me a couple times over the years, back when I led the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. So I have just deep love and respect for him and his voice.
Yeah, man. Glenn is a very, very powerful cat.
Well, can you guys join us for the after hours segment?
Yeah, I'm down.
All right. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. This has been Revolution. You'll probably be seeing this again on Zero Books. You'll be like, it's like the same video, except that he edited it a little bit. I did edit it a little bit. I've been putting credits in, and if you look real closely at the credits, I make slight fun jokes with Doug in the credits. I don't even think he notices them because he just puts it up. That's another reason why I do it.
Easter eggs for your friends, right? I mean, video games.
Did he just credit Doug Lain as being the man?
Have you credited anyone as being the GOAT lately?
Just don't put an E at the end of my name there. This LAIN. Stop.
No. Did I have I been doing that?
No, other people online.
I was gonna say no. I do it the right
People
way.
insult me, but they spell my name wrong, and I'm like,
that's even better.
Getting misspelled. If I had a nickel for every time I as Nancy Pelosi.
I
Yeah,
apparently
sure.
laugh like Wallace Shawn, according to Gene. I laugh like the Grand Nagus. Who's
So thank you guys. You guys here, don't hang up just yet. I got to give you the new link. And if you're a patron, the link will be up shortly for the after hour segment so we can all join in. And as you know, the after hour segment is different because we run the chat on the screen. There's no moderator. We curse a lot more. And by we, I mean me.
I was wondering exactly what the difference was, but now
There's a little difference. It gets a little more raw. It's almost like the Saturday shows. But Doug is going to be with us on the after hour, so that should be fun because a lot of times we actually make jokes at his expense. So now he'll be here for those jokes. So Jean Bajlan, I better see you there. So thank you guys, and we